I'm David S. Meyer. I'm a professor of sociology and political science at the University of California, Irvine. And my focus forever has been on social movements and efforts from below to try and change the world. And I wrote a book called The Politics of Protest Social Movements in America. And the last book I did was a co-edited book on the resistance to Donald Trump. And I blog periodically at a place called politicsoutdoors.com. So I'm interested in the payoff of protest, how it matters sometimes, and why it emerges when it does, and when it makes a difference. There's a couple of things that have come out that seem a little bit different at the outset. One thing is, like lots and lots of movements, nobody predicted it happening the way it did and when it did. And people act surprised that like, oh, nobody thought this was going to happen. So that's kind of similar. Second thing that's a little bit interesting is there's no one group or coalition taking responsibility for everything. So the character of the demonstrations in different places seems pretty different. And although there are similarities linking the protests across the country, there are also lots and lots of local differences and local grievances. Three, a lot of the observers have said there's more white people in these Black Lives Matter protests than ever before. And I haven't seen sort of a systematic census anywhere, but it looks like that, and we're trying to figure out why that is. And I think there's two main points to make. One point is this stuff didn't come out of nowhere. The protests against police violence and racialized violence in the United States are really, really, really old and long-standing in America, is almost as long-standing as violence against Black people and people of color. And it was a major concern of the NAACP at the beginning part of the 20th century. Black Lives Matter appears in 2013 and has local protests across the country. And then in 2015, you have campus-based protests against monuments and against, institutional racism. So this is stuff that's been percolating. And then in terms of the white people out at these demonstrations, the opposition to Donald Trump's social movement that started before he even took office and has continued since that time. So there are all these people who have been socialized into protest, and in this very, very polarized environment, they are opportunistically, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, I mean, I think they're taking advantage of the moment, joining in on an issue that's ripe for action. So it's not out of nowhere, there's a longer backstory, and there's a longer backstory on the particular issue, Black Lives Matter, and there's a longer backstory on the white people and the non-Black people who are out there in the streets and doing other things like calling legislators and maybe even voting in November. Already, let me back that up a little bit. So what impact do we expect a protest to have? The first thing it's supposed to do is to draw attention to an issue. It's certainly done that, and it's certainly resurrected attention to other issues like the monuments and like police practices. Second, we expect it to we hope it generates policy change, at least if we agree with the movement. And that's already happened in a lot of cities which have adopted modest reforms so far. Like, not when I say modest, I don't mean insignificant, but ending chokeholds. Requiring body cams, and also on the monuments, taking down some monuments. And none of this stuff is new, but it's kind of like been loaded up through political efforts of the past. And these demonstrations have come along and allowed politicians who wanted to do something to have cover for doing it. So it's sort of like flip all the cards all at once. So the proximate effects are much greater than we usually see for any campaign because it's happened quickly. And at the same time, given the concerns of the people who are out in the street, the proximate effects are still modest. I mean, it still does very little to address racial incarceration, mass incarceration. It does little to address massive economic inequality, actually nothing. And the reforms on policing are still in an early stage. If this is really, really, really successful, it winds up building a coalition for reform that engages in American politics over the long haul and is there to bargain for and execute larger scale reforms on not just policing, but on history and the teaching of history, which would include these monuments, but is much bigger than that, and on economic issues and all kinds of other elements of institutionalized racism that animate America. The first thing America owes Black people and all people is a true accounting of the history, and a history that's comprehensive and accessible and honest. And I think that Americans have been spared coming to grips with all the contradictions that are inherent in the American story. And the issue of reparations demands, I think, first a truth and reconciliation process that's big and includes some sort of official commission and includes reforms in high school curricula and includes like real education for Americans and the next generation. And that'll spill over to things like monuments too. But when people talk about reparations, they're talking about something bigger than that. And I have no idea whether the right answer is to give every descendant of someone who was enslaved $200,000 or $100. I mean, I have no way to calibrate that. But there's no question that systematic institutional racism has affected very strongly the accumulation of wealth that African Americans have had less opportunity to do than other people, including immigrants. How to compensate for that? I don't know. I mean, I think it's a really important issue. I think like money is like definitely something that we use to pay compensation. I'm not opposed to doing that at all, but I think we need to develop a process that comes to terms with who's been cheated out of what, and how do we even things out in a more substantial way. I know that there are people who have like dollar figures. I don't know what the right number is and what the right way to distribute it is. I do know that it takes more than just saying, well, everybody should have an equal opportunity from here on. I think some compensatory action and atonement makes sense. When he talks about this, I don't want to pretend that I'm thinking of this stuff on my own, because I got it from listening to him. When he talks about this, he says, you go to Germany and there are monuments to the Holocaust. And Germany pays reparations to Israel still. Mm-hmm. And it says, and that means that in, a formal way, Germany takes responsibility for some of the evil one regime perpetrated. And I've been to Berlin and I've seen some of the memorials, and I think it's powerful. And I think giving people some sense of responsibility, even if they were not personally responsible, makes a lot of sense to me. So my tradition is Jewish, and every year there's a Passover Seder. And in the Passover Seder, you tell the story of Hebrews coming out of slavery and having an obligation to work for justice that comes from once we were slaves. Now, obviously, I personally was never a slave. And my family came to the United States way after the Civil War. But I'm a human who's living in a country where, by virtue of the color of my skin, I derive some benefits that I have found it very easy to take for granted. And real truth in accounting means that you can't take it for granted anymore. You have to know what the real story is and pay attention to privilege. With privilege comes responsibility. This morning when we're talking, no, but this afternoon could be different. And, next week could be really different. And I think that there's this unfortunate fatalism that people who are opposed to change are always able to invoke. So it's really, really, really not that long ago that President Obama said that Americans weren't necessarily ready for same-sex marriage. And that almost seems silly now, right? I mean, it's something like, it's almost not even interesting anymore that we just accept that that's the case. One of the things that I always marvel at and I love is the students in my school, the University of California, Irvine, are from all over the place. And they have different facial features and they're different skin tones, and they have names that I sometimes have difficulty pronouncing because when I went to school, everybody was named Bill or Carol. And I know that when I was in school, people took for granted that that's the way it was and that it couldn't be other than that. And change happens like that sometimes. And then we take it for granted and we forget that it wasn't always this way. And you see that on all kinds of little things in our lives. I was driving on the road on the freeway yesterday, and I saw signs for marijuana dispensaries. And it's really not that long ago that getting marijuana was completely illegal. Now, I don't think that that's the most important social change in America in the last 10 years, but it indicates how quickly things can shift. And so you ask, are we ready for a serious discussion about reparations? Well, you don't know you're ready until you start doing it. The deficit of like becoming an academic and studying all this stuff is that you get really good at dismantling optimistic projections about the future. You have to remember, one, that there's just like tons of people who've like changed the world who were in far worse circumstances than we are now. And, when things looked objectively much, much worse. And, so when I talk to my students about it, I always tell them about the 4 undergraduates at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College in Greensboro in 1960 who stay up all night and say, we're going to desegregate the South. That sounds nuts, right? I mean, that sounds nuts. How could that possibly happen? And I always imagine that like some guy down the hall in the dorm is saying, yeah, well, okay, you do that. I'm going to study for biology, And it's really easy to block out the possible and to just say things are going to be as they've always been. One effect of the COVID crisis that we're living through is that, the deck has been redealt. We know that things that we didn't think were possible could happen. So that's like one piece of it. It's like you look at history, and then I don't know anybody who would have predicted that the next mass shooting in January 2018 would generate these really clever kids in Parkland, Florida, drawing national attention to an issue. Because I tell you, none of the academics I know would have predicted it or would have seen that these kids would be, capable of doing that, or that a girl in Sweden, and that's only one example. There are lots of kids across the world who are doing it. Would bring attention to climate change through starting a one-person strike. So in real life, things are possible that we just don't even imagine could happen. At the same time, change is always so much slower than you think it's going to be, and you never get all you want. And so, you know, if you march for racial justice and get body cams, that's a victory, but it's not everything and it's not enough. And so the trick for people who are promoting social change is to learn to take gains gracelessly and to demand more and more and more, but still claim the victories you've had. And I get frustrated when I talk to academics, and since I am one, it happens all the time, who are just like, oh, nothing ever changes. It's just like we still have industrial capitalism in the world. Well, yeah, but on the margins, things get better, things get worse. And what you do matters on those margins, and those margins affect lives. So the claim, for example, that, oh, Trump would be good because he would spur the forces of reform to engage. Well, that kind of happened ultimately, but at the same time, at what cost? The real human costs of lives on the border, of people who don't have housing, of people who are losing health insurance. So, the stuff about our lives matters a lot, and the efforts of activists can matter. I'm very much looking forward to seeing what you put together. And, the stuff you do matters in setting examples for other people. I got an email a couple of weeks ago from a girl who identified herself as African American, concerned with supporting Black Lives Matter, going to some demonstrations, and asking me, what should I do next? What should I do now? And the old guys so absolutely don't know the answer to that. And the smart thing for us to do, I mean, my people, the old academics, is to encourage your generation to innovate and try stuff, and to sort of open a space where it's legitimate, like where your innovation and your experiments, can take flight. And that most of the stuff you do isn't going to take off. But the payoff for the things that do is immense. And you have to keep trying stuff because you can't exactly predict in advance which thing is going to be it. I have like one political point which I'm really worked up about.
Yeah.
Which is that the next administration should be in a position to change the world. One good thing about Joe Biden is he's not scared of deficit spending. There's kind of mainstream economic wisdom now is that the way out of this crisis, the economic part of the crisis, is to spend like crazy, is to, borrow money, print money, loan money, everything, and just like pump up the economy to get things going again. And it's a time when these ideas about a Green New Deal could actually make a huge amount of sense. And I would like to see, activists pushing immediately for bailing out the states so that universities aren't in crisis, so that public schools aren't in crisis. And that's like the top thing on my political agenda right now. Spend money.